it. And so I'll take a second to sort of, frame this topic for today, which is about international standards for elections and what that means in practice. And then I'll go into briefly introducing our panelists to allow more time to hear from them. And so just to frame this panel is to help us learn about international standards for elections and international election observation and the roles that both international standards and international observers can play, especially in the 2020 US election process, but also globally. And so democracy has raised through the ranks to be the most praised, revered, or accepted form of governance in the world. But there's a famous quote by Winston Churchill attributed to him to the effect that democracy is the worst form of government with the exception of everything else that has been tried. So even though democracy is not perfect per se, it is something that we aspire to, and elections are the underpinning mechanism by which democracy functions. So though elections are conducted and can look very different across the world, governed by different laws, different geographies, levels of literacy, what is common around the world is the practice of election observation, be it by domestic citizen organizations or international regional organizations, or organizations like the Carter Center, which are international and non-governmental. And examples of those are the Organization of American States, the OAS, and also the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and both of those are fielding observers to the US elections this year. And so while all elections are different, there are international principles and obligations that are commonly accepted as underpinning all electoral processes, including in the United States. So to help observers assess the quality of elections, the Carter Center has worked with others to help articulate international standards for democratic elections, drawing on two things: international obligations on one side and public international law. And so today we'll learn more about these standards and how they govern international election observation missions and how the US is involved in such efforts and how these standards apply to key aspects in the US election. So with that, we have assembled here a marvelous panel of three highly qualified individuals to discuss this topic. And I'll begin briefly by introducing Olifonto Akinduro, and she is Senior Program Officer at International IDEA, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. And she works on elections in Africa and West Asia. She's an electoral processes lead expert for the region, and she's dedicated to election assessment, election management, and better understanding and assessing campaign finance. Olifonto, thank you so much for being with us today. We're very happy to have you.
Thank
And
you.
then, thank you. Next, we have Larry Garber with us, and Larry brings with him decades of election-related experience. He served on the faculty of the National Defense University. He was a senior policymaker at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and its mission director in the West Bank and Gaza. And after more than 30 years of focusing on elections overseas, Larry co-founded the Election Reformers Network in 2017 to help bring those lessons, global lessons, back to the United States. Larry, it's an honor to have you with us today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here.
And last but not least, we have Jesse Pilgrim. Jesse is a lawyer with more than 35 years of experience and a legal consultant with international organizations. And in addition to his legal practice in Oklahoma, Jesse has managed to provide legal opinion and reviews in over 30 countries, including the United States. So with this breadth of expertise and knowledge, let's delve into the content for today. So Jesse, if you don't mind, if we could start with you, the first question is pretty basic, and it's this: what are international election standards? Where did they emerge from, and why are they important?
Thank you, Rana. I like to think of the international standards as being a bundle of measuring sticks that international observers put into their observation bag when they go to another country to observe the elections. And we use these measuring sticks in general to determine to what extent the election is a genuine democratic election. But that's rather broad, so we have to break it down even more. We use these measuring sticks to determine to what extent the election was conducted by universal and equal suffrage, by secret ballot, without any unreasonable restrictions on voters and candidates. Then we look at whether there was any type of discrimination against voters or candidates based on race, sex, religion, national origin, property status, something of that nature. But to do that, it requires that you look at the entire election process. It's not just looking at election day, what happens with the voting and tabulation. The election observation mission opens its bag out and has a measuring stick for different elements of the election. There's an international standard regarding the rule of law and what the written structure of the legal framework should be. We pull out a standard to measure boundary, how boundaries are established, and the size of constituencies and the ratio between the number of voters and a candidate. We pull out a different measuring stick for election management to see how election management is structured, whether it's independent, whether it conducts itself independently. We pull out a measuring stick for the media, see what the media does in the elections, how much freedom the media has, what ability candidates and political parties have to get on media platforms. We pull out a measuring stick for campaign rules, campaign finance. We measure to what extent political parties and candidates have the ability to hold rallies and to speak freely. We pull out a measuring stick for voter education because voters have a right to be informed of the election processes. They have a right to be informed of the platforms of the candidates. We pull out a measuring stick for how the votes are actually counted on election day. There's another measuring stick for tabulation and another measuring stick for electoral disputes to see if there are any disputes and how those disputes are handled. So in short, basically the standards are a group of measuring sticks that we can walk all over the globe with and measure an election in any country to see how the election measures up against these sticks that we carry with us. Now, the importance of the sticks, the importance of having these international standards that there's broad consensus, these are the rules that apply to elections, is that we can identify deficiencies in elections. And by identifying deficiencies in elections, we can make recommendations for improvement of electoral processes, which is a good thing because it's good to improve on the processes because it strengthens democracy. The other thing that's important about it, it's a mechanism for ensuring voters that their will has been respected in the election processes. So it restores confidence in government and it ensures that voters know that their voice has been heard and that the government is a government of their choosing. Now, where did the measuring sticks come from? That's very important because everyone should be held to the same standard. What is good for the US should be good for Canada or France or Germany or anywhere else. It should be good on any continent. And so we've had to go to what you have previously mentioned as public international law, because public international law is the basis for which nations agree that they will behave or conduct their behavior. And public international law is the source for our standards. Primarily, there are two elements to it. One is the easy part, which would be international treaties that are part of the UN treaty system. Generally, those treaties have been approved or ratified by a number of countries, and they have gone into force. And so those are the easy measuring sticks for us to have in our bag. The main ones that we use are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We use the Convention to Eliminate Racial Discrimination, the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. There are some other ones like the Anti-Corruption Treaty, Convention on Migrant Workers, Convention on the Rights of the Child. We use these international documents because there's not very much dispute as to their application. So those are the main ones. The other ones that we have to use come from what we call customary international law, and these are sources of law that may not be international treaties, they may be regional treaties, but they're regional treaties with a broad collection of countries, such as the European Charter, or they may be a political commitment, such as political commitments made by OSCE member states. And if you look at the European Charter, you're talking about 47 countries. If you look at the OSCE commitments, you're talking about 57 countries. But you also have these same regional commitments in the Americas and in Africa, and also in the Arab world. So there are plenty of documents that we can look at to pull together our measuring sticks when we go on these observation missions. Now, one of the questions was, are they legally binding? In the realm of the UN treaties, they are legally binding if a country has agreed to be bound to the enforcement mechanisms of the UN. You can ratify a treaty, but not necessarily agree to be bound by the enforcement mechanism. And not all countries agree to be bound by the enforcement mechanism. But even if you don't agree to be bound by the enforcement mechanism, it doesn't mean that the standard is not an international standard. The standard still applies, it's just the country can't be beaten over the head with it. And it's the same thing with regional documents. There are regional treaties that can be enforced by regional tribunals. That was pretty short, that was quick, but that's kind of a down and dirty overview of the standards.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Jesse. And so moving from those standards and the measuring sticks, let me, Olifonto, address this question to you. How have these standards been applied in different contexts around the globe?
Thanks so much, Rana. And thanks, Jesse, for that great introduction to what these standards are and their usefulness. I'd just like to pick up from where Jesse stopped, talking about election standards as the basis from which election observers carry on their work, so that we don't have a situation where we walk into a certain context and we have a completely different assessment of what we consider a democratic election is. The standards actually help us to agree on what do we mean by democratic elections, and then from there we can begin to ask questions about the different aspects of it. Jesse as well mentioned the fact that as you go across different regions, you have different obligations. I think I'd then start by mentioning that even though we have different obligations, based on the different regional institutions that have a mandate as you go across regions, those standards are really pretty much the same. So for instance, you come to Africa and you have the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. The principles enshrined in that charter are exactly the same, and they draw on the UN instruments. So that said, basically observers go into the countries, and the main question is, what are the obligations of country X or country Y? And to what extent has this particular country fulfilled those obligations? Sometimes people have a sense that observers are judges. They're supposed to go there and say this is a good election or this is a bad election, a great one, a not so great one. But when you look at those standards, they actually do not allow you to answer those questions in a yes or no format. And they actually just allow you to go into each country and make an assessment that says, to what extent have you met those standards? Of course, observer reports differ in a way, because as you go to different regions, the mandates are stronger in some regions. I like to use Africa as an example. For instance, you come and you look at the African Union and you go to West Africa, it's ECOWAS, Southern Africa is SADC, but you would find that in West Africa, you might see more of a stronger assessment by the regional body. But as you go towards the South, it's slightly, more diplomatic and more political, and you don't have those kinds of strong assessments. However, you would read maybe, for instance, an EU report on an African country, because they would look at broader standards beyond just the AU or the ECOWAS instruments. They would look at other UN instruments as well. That strengthens the kinds of observation that these groups make as you go across. But I think the most important point to make is the fact that regardless of the instrument you pick up, the standards are universal, and we work to define democratic elections in the same way. However, contexts differ and history also differs. So each country you will go and you would find them with their national legal frameworks, really reflecting the history of that particular country. So what you would find in the US is completely different from what you would find when you go to the United Kingdom. But the principles are the same. It's just that you're looking at two different countries, two different contexts, and the national laws have been built in a way that they respond to the history of these different countries.
Thank you, Olifanto. Thank you so much. And so now that we've heard more from Jesse and Olifanto on what are these measuring sticks? How do they vary across regions? Larry, if you don't mind me asking you, how do these international standards apply to certain issues that are commonly raised in the US context? And the first issue that I would pose to you is, how would these international standards apply to the issue raised in the US context of electing a chief executive who does not receive the most votes?
Thank you, Rana, and thanks for that question. It's one that's been bedeviling the United States since 1788, and it's been the subject of much debate for the last 240 years. Basically, since the Constitution was adopted, which created the Electoral College, there's been a lively debate in Congress and elsewhere as to how to shift that system. And what's basically been impossible is to get the political will to actually shift it, whether to a popular vote on a nationwide basis or to other systems. But let me start with the question in terms of the international standards. And so where does this fit? And clearly there's a strong preference in the international system for what we would call one person, one vote, the equality of suffrage, and the like. And the Electoral College has a number of deficiencies associated with it. But if you frame it as a question of how are chief executives elected, there are lots of different contexts in different countries in which the chief executive is not elected as the person who receives the most votes. Just take your parliamentary systems, where the prime minister is basically selected as the chief executive in effect, but he's or she is there because they have the majority of votes in the parliament, which may or may not correspond to the popular vote across the country. So as Olifanto just said, elections and election laws and processes need to be considered against the international standards, but also given the historical context in which they were established. And I'll just say, in terms of the United States, for most of our history, we assumed that the Electoral College and the popular vote would correspond. And in the majority of elections, they have. There have only been 5 exceptions going back to 1788, 1824, 1876, and 1888. And then none in the 20th century. So we assumed that, somehow the math had allowed us to correspond the Electoral College with a popular vote. Now, 2 of the last 5 elections, in 2000 and 2016, we've seen examples where the person was elected who did not receive the most popular votes. And that's created this issue, once again, that's on the table of what do we need to reform the Electoral College system to make it, not only more in conformance with international standards, but more in conformance with what we intuitively believe is a better system of ensuring that the majority of the voters basically decide such a key position as the chief executive.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. And then here I have a sequence of a few issues I'd like to touch upon. So that was the first one. And Olifanto, the second one, I would address to you. And that's the issue in the US context that requires that voters present ID cards, identification cards, at the polling site. So how do international standards deal with this issue, and how has it been handled in other countries?
Thanks, Rana. The issue of presenting a form of identification at the polling site, I think it speaks to the question of the right and equal opportunity to vote without any undue restrictions imposed on the voter. I mean, maybe because I'm African, it almost sounds like it's straightforward for you to have some form of ID. But when you look at it in a bigger picture, in the US, where the question of identification and who has access to an identity document and what kind of identity documents are voters required to present, then that question of the right and opportunity to vote for all eligible citizens then becomes a big question. From my understanding, I mean, let me just backtrack a bit to what I had said before about each country, writing its national laws on the basis of its history and experience. And in the US, it's a very peculiar question around the fact that owning an ID, for instance, a driver's license, and the question of persons who have been previously convicted to continue to hold an identification. And then in the long term, then the question of, are these people able to vote? I was looking through the OSCE report on 2016 elections, and it was one of the main issues raised and one of the recommendations made. Currently, there are 34 states that require some form of identification from a voter. And when you begin to drill down and ask questions about the fact that ex-convicts in some states have their licenses withdrawn, or questions around how some states have deliberately or systematically created laws that make it difficult for certain proportions of the population to get access to ID documents. And in the long run, that means as well the question of how they get access to the voting process and their franchise eventually. So this is a big issue. And by international standards, you ask the question of how does this work in other places? Of course, because in the US, you have a myriad of other forms of identity. You look at a space like Africa, for instance, where most countries don't have a national civil registry. You don't have the social security numbers like you have in the US, that stays with you your entire life. And it's possible to tell who is this and where is this person? Is this person within the country at the moment or not? In Africa, you have people who have to go out and register. And then there's a question of how easy is it to register? How easy is it to get those cards? And at the end of the day, you then have a question of a good proportion of the population, not voting on election day because they are not willing to go through that process of getting these IDs. So it's a big issue. I mean, when you have systems that deliberately are created to keep some sections of the population off the voting space or not exercising their electoral rights.
Thank you, Alifonso, and I'll stick with you. So thank you for talking to us about identification requirements. But shifting, another issue that it's commonly raised in the U.S. context is basically the mail-in voting. So how would international standards apply to expanding mail-in voting in response to the pandemic?
Thanks for that question. I think as well, this is an issue that also borders on the right and opportunity to vote as well. It speaks to the same international standards. And when you look at the question of voting procedures, the question observers would usually ask when they go into the country is, to what extent do the laws and the procedures put in place provide an opportunity for all eligible voters to cast their vote? And when you look at the question of eligible voters, be they voters within the country, be they voters currently outside the country. In some countries, persons in correctional facilities are also allowed to vote. Sick persons are also allowed to vote, or the elderly who just cannot get out of their homes to physically go and cast their ballots. So you then begin to question the extent to which the voting procedures and the voting laws allow persons to vote. In the US, the system allows for absentee voting, which is done mainly through the mail. So whether you're a person in the country, outside the country, who for some reason cannot present yourself on the designated day, which will be the 3rd of November, you have an opportunity to vote. The pandemic, however, has made it important for states in the US to then expand this opportunity. The way the mailing ballot works is, in some states, you need a reason. You need to give a reason you apply, and you give a reason to say, this is why I cannot present myself on voting day. In some states, if I'm correct, I think 5 states allow you to, all voters in 5 states automatically receive the mail ballot. But with the COVID pandemic, most states have now amended their rules around mailing ballots to allow for persons who, well, not just for persons who can't present themselves, but to expand the opportunity and not make it mandatory for every voter to present themselves at a polling station. Of course, it's as a means of reducing the spread of the virus, but beyond just reducing the spread of the virus, it's also to just provide that opportunity so that the virus is not an excuse for qualified voters to cast their ballots. And I see that only 12 states have not made any form of modification to their mailing ballot procedures or their guidelines. So it's really a big deal when you see the number of states that have, amended their rules around casting the ballot by mail. So, I mean, if you ask me, my sense is that it's a great opportunity that is outside the controversies around how is it being done, the concerns. But if you ask on a broader term, it's a great opportunity because it opens that space to all, and you are not enforced to come in person compared to other contexts like in Africa where I think Mauritius is the only African country that has provisions for proxy voting. Mailing ballots are not the norm at all. So which means you all have to present yourself. So even if you're outside the country, you still have to go to the embassy of your country to vote on the designated day. So with mailing ballots, you have, bigger opportunities, but there are concerns around it. The question of the independence of the voter to make a free choice. How do you know that wherever he or she is sitting, to cast that ballot, he or she is not influenced in making that choice? There are also concerns about the understanding of the different procedures, because as you go across every state, the rules differ. And just for people to understand, how does this work? I think I'll leave it there. And if we have more time, we could talk about it further.
Thank you very much for running us through like maybe the pros and cons of mail-in voting. Shifting to another issue that's commonly raised, and Larry, I will address this one to you, is how do these measuring sticks that we discussed, the standards, international standards, how would they apply to the issue of having elections administered by individuals who are themselves chosen through a partisan electoral process?
Thanks, Rana. And let me just add a little to Olafonto's answer on the mail-in ballot issue. I think just thinking about mail-in ballots, it gives us an opportunity to reflect on how international standards evolve. I mean, they're not static. They don't stay in the same place. As Olafonto said, many African countries would, or other countries would be very surprised at, or feel it quite inappropriate to introduce mail-in ballots. And yet the United States, we've had 5 states, as she mentioned, that have had mail-in ballots even before the pandemic. So technology matters in terms of evolving standards for a particular context. Events matter. So the pandemic clearly has been a triggering event for many states to expand their idea of having absentee or mail-in ballots as a choice for voters. As I said, the technology has allowed us to deal with some of the concerns that historically would be raised about fraud prevention or fraud in the context of mail-in ballots. So now they can be tracked. You can know exactly who's voting, who's voted and stuff like that. So obviate the concerns about multiple voting. And again, it reflects the importance of giving election administrators the flexibility to respond to circumstances, as opposed to being completely circumscribed and unable to deal with that. So again, I think in the United States, we've had a really positive response to the pandemic, with the expansion of mail-in balloting, with the expansion of in-person early voting, and with some other efforts to ensure that people don't face the choice of health versus casting or using or implementing their right to vote. On the issue you raised about election administrators, so I was really surprised to learn when we began about 3 years ago to look at this issue, that the United States is the only country in the world that uses an election to elect the people who are responsible for administering elections. In the United States, in about 4/5 of our states, the chief election officer in the state is someone who has been elected in a partisan election, either as a Democrat or Republican, and she or he is then responsible for administering the elections. Now, in most cases, and again, given the historical evolution of our country, this has been the process, and in most cases, this has not been a big issue. Institutional culture may play a role. The whole fact that even at the state level, things are very decentralized. So you don't only have the chief election officer, but you have every county has its own election officer in effect. So those have all contributed to the fact that this issue has not been a major concern, but there have been examples where it has come to the fore. Many of us remember Florida 2000, when the Secretary of State there, a woman by the name of Catherine Harris, played a major role in the dispute between the Republicans and Democrats. And she happened to have been the co-chair of the Bush for President campaign in Florida. And there have been other examples in Ohio in 2004, in Georgia in 2018, where the Secretary of State, who was responsible for administering the election, has been called out for various acts that were seen as helping her or his political party. So many of us have advocated for adopting the system that's used around the globe of either having an independent commission or of having someone who is vetted through a process whereby they are not elected through a partisan election, but are responsible to some other organ and can be held accountable not only by voters, but by sort of ethical standards. In the meantime, we've urged that all secretaries of state or all chief election officers adhere to what we view as minimal standards, certainly those that we would expect if we were observers, that election officials would adhere to in their own countries. And so while I'm grateful that the professionalism of the election administrators has been quite good, there are lingering concerns, and I think we can do better by conforming with the practices overseas.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry, very much. And Jesse, I'm going to give you here, address the question to you in terms of, again, how the international standards apply to issues raised in the US context. And this one is the issue of campaign finance and unlimited spending. And how do international standards, how would they, what would they, well, not say judgment, but how does that compare?
The main goal of international standards related to campaign finance is that there be transparency, that voters know who's given money to political parties and candidates, and that voters know what amounts have been given. Transparency also requires that there be periodic reporting, that the reporting be done early enough in the election cycle so that voters can make choices based not only on candidate platforms, but also based on who is supporting candidates financially. Many countries have a limit on expenditures, but there is no international standard that says you have to have a limit on expenditures. In the context of Europe, the Council of Ministers for the Council of Europe, they have issued recommendations that states adopt limits on campaign expenditures, but there is no international standard that says that you got to stop how much is spent on a campaign. At least I'm not aware of it.
Thank you, Jesse. And now that we've discussed, international standards, their definition, how they might apply to certain issues in the US, let's transition a little bit into what that means for observation, election observation. So Larry, this question is to you. So what are the origins then of international election observation? And what are the standards that govern the operations of international observer missions?
So I could give a several-hour lecture on this topic, but I'll limit myself to a couple of key points. First of all, election observation goes back quite a while. The first, commonly recognized example is in the 1850s. There are examples, up through and after World War II, particularly in the process of decolonization in Africa and elsewhere. But it really has become a much more a part of our processes and daily practices since 1980. And you often use the 1980 election in Zimbabwe that was observed by the Commonwealth as really the first time that election observation was used both to facilitate conflict resolution in that case, as well as to mediate between competing parties and to bring in a respected organization, in that case, the Commonwealth, using a fairly sophisticated approach of extended observation on the ground to the process. And the 80s really were when elections became the subject of observation in a much more rigorous manner. And the two elections that I highlight are the 1986 election in the Philippines, where the observers, international observers, really contributed to the shift in public opinion internationally, that reinforced the work that was being done by the Filipinos in terms of mobilizing to challenge the fraudulent election that had occurred. And ultimately, the international observers managed to influence the US president and the US administration, which then put pressure on the incumbent president, who had been, quote unquote, reelected through this fraudulent process, to leave the country and to accept that his opponent had won. And the second big election was in 1990 in Nicaragua, where for the first time, the United Nations observed an election in a sovereign country, in a member state country, and the OAS organized an election observation that wasn't just a 2-day event of flying in, flying out, but really had a serious methodology associated with it. Those processes of the Philippines, Nicaragua, and a whole bunch of others ultimately led in 2005 to the adoption of the Declaration of Principles to Guide International Observers, which is a declaration. So it's not, as Jesse was saying earlier, it's not a formal treaty, but it has been recognized by many non-governmental organizations, many intergovernmental organizations, and it really provides the criteria for organizing and establishing election observation missions. And that is then coupled with some of the regional developments that Jesse alluded to in the Western Hemisphere under the Organization of American States, in Europe under the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, where there are treaties now, and in Africa there's likewise, where there are treaties now that create an expectation that member states of these organizations will welcome international observers, and that the internationals will undertake their efforts in conformity with the Declaration of Principles. So there is now at least a tradition that exists, that if you don't invite observers, you don't welcome observers, that you're going against the customs that now exist in terms of democratic practices.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for telling that story and highlighting in particular the experience of the Philippines and Nicaragua. And that segues into the next question a little bit, which I'd like to ask Olifanto, is that, can you give us an example of a constructive role played by international observers? And as a follow-up question to that, what happens if observers conclude that there were flaws in the electoral process?
Thanks very much, Rana, and thanks, Larry, for that great background to, giving that overview of how international observation has evolved over time. And I think, as Jesse mentioned, we have now come to a point where it is unacceptable to have a country that says observers are no longer welcome, or they are not welcome for one reason or the other. For instance, even in this context of the pandemic, off the top of my head, I think only Burundi in Africa, for instance, Burundi was the only country that gave conditions for observers to access, their elections. You would have situations where some countries would want to pick and choose which observer groups come. But overall, observers play very constructive roles in terms of holding states accountable to their obligations within the international legal framework, as initially explained by Jesse. There are obligations which these states have signed up to, and some of those obligations are binding, some are more of just advisory, or how do I explain that? But for the ones that are binding, even for the advisory ones, observers really go in there to do that job of saying, this is what you have committed to do. To what extent have you achieved this? Then also, observers also serve the purpose of, in highly contested elections, I mean, they play the role of dousing tensions, making interventions that make it easier for contestants to accept the outcome of results, because observers are considered to be independent in their assessment of a process. And I mean, over time, just as Larry mentioned, the scope of observation has moved from just, we come on election day and we talk about whether people stood in queues, whether the ballot boxes were available. And now you have more and more groups linking their work of observation to their work of electoral assistance or technical assistance to their member states, especially for intergovernmental bodies. So in this way, I think over time, international observation has come to play a very, very critical role. One, in dousing tensions within elections. Two, promoting the credibility of the process. In some contexts, you would have observers also contributing to deterring fraud. I'm not saying they do it effectively, but they do contribute to that. I'd like to give, for instance, as an example, the 2019 elections in Nigeria, or the 2018 elections in Sierra Leone, where really the international observers played beyond just the role of checking at the stations. They also played a mediatory role between the Electoral Commission and the contestants. In transition elections, for instance, Tunisia 2012, after the Arab Spring, international observers played a key role in ensuring that those transition elections, you could even consider South Africa 1994 as well, transition elections, the role of observers within such context, I think cannot be argued. But beyond that, as I mentioned, you now have observer reports serving as the basis of some level of technical assistance to countries. So if observers do identify that there are challenges, there's also room for some institutions to provide support to address some of those challenges. To your next question, what happens if observers say there was fraud? I think I'll start to respond to that with the question of, don't forget, we do not give black and white assessments. So observers can say there was fraud, and they are usually detailed enough to say to what extent, was there fraud, and what is the overall impact of such on the election, on the integrity of the elections. So you have, for instance, I would use, for instance, the OAS report on Bolivia, where the audit, clearly the OAS said this was not a credible process, and the OAS supported the call for a rerun election. But that's not always the case everywhere. So, I mean, I would say that the kinds of actions different groups can take differ by their scope. So intergovernmental organizations like your OSCE, your OAS, have that mandate to intervene in their member states to an extent. But when you look at international NGOs like your Carter Centers and ISA and the rest of them, reports really very much just inform recommendations for reforms. That's looking forward and saying in the next elections, what? And you've also had situations where the judiciary would call on observers and use observer reports as evidence in some countries to prove that their findings on the issue of credibility of elections to strengthen their position. So, I mean, in these ways, you found observer groups play different roles as you go along.
Thank you, Olifanto. And then the natural question that emerges from that, I'll address to Jesse, brings it back to the US, and then we might have maybe some time, depending on how speedy Jesse is, to address another question. But let's start here. So what is the US experience with international observation? And what is expected from international observers in the US in the event of a dispute regarding the outcome of the presidential election?
Let me ask, I'll be speedy too. Let me answer the last part of the question first. Observers, if they are doing their job completely, if there's a dispute at the end of the election, then the observers stay in the country and they observe how the issues are adjudicated, whether it be in a court of law or if it's just public discontent. Because to write a complete report, what happens after the election can be just as important as to what happens before the election. Regarding the US experience with observation, I think it's important to note that around 2000, 2002, there was a pretty good argument within the OSCE about whether observation should go west of Vienna and whether established democracies should be subject to observation activities. The consensus was that just because you've been around 200 years, you're not special. You may be a wonderful democracy, but even wonderful democracies have problems with their elections. And the main problem being, do you extend the right of suffrage on a universal and equal basis? And we only have to look at our own experience to know that half of the US population for a very long time, even while the US was a good democracy, didn't have the opportunity to vote. So the decision was made around 2000, 2002 that Western democracies, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, that they could benefit from election observation. It didn't mean they didn't have established democracies. It didn't mean they weren't good democracies. It just meant that there could be improvement in the electoral processes. So you saw the first election observation mission from the OSCE in the United States in 2002. The OSCE went to the United Kingdom in 2004, and they've observed elections in France, Germany, and what we consider established democracies. And I like to use the analogy of my own home. It's an old home, but over the course of time, I've had to change the electrical wiring in it because there are requirements for electrical wiring, even in old houses. So we all benefit from election observation because observers can make recommendations that improve the election process. One final comment I want to make on this is if we look at our UN treaty system and look at our the main UN treaties that we have, general comments are issued by treaty enforcement bodies related to those instruments. And one thing that's pointed out in every one of those general comments related to a specific treaty is that you're not special. These treaty obligations, these standards apply to everyone. And if they didn't apply to everyone and you could get out by just saying I'm special, then they wouldn't apply to anybody. So I tried to make that speedy.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jesse. And then I think what you say ties in nicely to a question in the chat. I know it's already 1 p.m., but if I can extend 60 seconds and we'll see, because you raised the issue of established democracies and perhaps the idea nobody's special. But the question in the chat is on the other end of the spectrum. Like, are there bare minimum election procedures countries must commit to before their elections are analyzed in the first place? And so, I mean, that's one question from the chat. And they give an example. They once read that the Carter Center wouldn't analyze US elections because voting procedures aren't uniform nationwide. But the crux of the question, are there minimum standards that need to be set in place in order to observe in the first place? Who'd like to take a crack at that one?
I'll just answer quickly is that many observation groups do, do pre-election missions in particular to consider whether the conditions are appropriate for observing the elections. And oftentimes when those minimal conditions are not there, they will be quite hesitant about observing the election. But occasionally will go ahead and observe the election, particularly if, opposition groups that are feeling that the election is quite um, unbalanced or that they're disadvantaged. If those groups still think that there's a value to having the international observers, even though the minimal conditions have not been met, they may go ahead and observe the election, still using the international standards that have been referenced, and reporting as objectively as they can on the both positive and negative elements of the process. So it depends on the situation. It depends on the types of reactions that folks on the ground provide to the organization, and it depends on the types of issues that they hope can be evaluated through an on-the-ground presence while weighed against the realities of potentially legitimizing an illegitimate process.
Thank you, Larry. Would Jesse or Olifanto would like to chime in on this?
Thanks. I think just one thing I'll just like to add, I mean, because sometimes the opposition thinks it's great for you to be there, but you could also consider it, and if it's a completely closed space where whatever the observer reports you offer would be seen as a support of the incumbent, I think then you would want to stay away from there. And lastly, if there is just like restriction of access for international observers, because some countries say come. So for instance, there are observers in Tanzania right now, and last week, there's this thing about you need to submit your reports to the commission to be vetted before they go on. So such restrictions could also, inform that decision not to observe.
Rana, if I could just add 30 seconds on the second part of the question, which I think is actually very important, which is, the United States is a unique system. We do have 51 different jurisdictions conducting elections. Each one has its own laws that are governing. And it does pose additional challenges to an international observer mission. And if you read the reports of the OSCE, ODIHR that just came out about the 2020 election. They just issued an interim report, or you read the needs assessment report, you see how they struggle with trying to evaluate 51 states in, general, against general standards and against, as a whole. And so it does pose an additional burden, and not impossible. They do it, but it is something that I think you're correct in pointing out, that does, make a particular challenge to the United States system.
Thank you, Larry. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Jesse, Olifanto, Larry, all the panelists for having such a global and granular discussion at the same time. It was truly fascinating and very informative. So thank you tremendously much for your time. And I pass the torch on to Yamil if you have any closing comments.
I just want to reiterate Rana's thanks to our panelists. We are so grateful that during this incredibly busy time, you were able to carve out an hour to share your expertise with us, which is truly invaluable. I'm also grateful for everyone who joined today. And again, you'll be able to see a recording of today's session at electionsos.com, along with the rest of the webinars in the series and other resources. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.